Alright guys, in this video about Tennyson Knows Nothing, we're going to be working on a website called PyBites. Um, this is a website that was put together by a couple of Python developers who decided that they were tired of code challenges that didn't have anything to do with real life. And Code Wars is kind of that way in the sense that most of the problems are very they're sort of organized around this idea of just puzzles and fun things, whereas PyBites focuses on learning about actual career-oriented Python or professional Python, I guess is a good way to say it. So it's all very realistic. You get to use the full set of like libraries that are available to a Python programmer, which is a little different than what you might get on some of these other sites where you're just solving like the sort of interesting algorithmic question about how you should go about coding whatever it is. So I'm not doing a very good job explaining that, but basically, PyBites is a great site if you want to be a better practical Python programmer. Like if your job is to write Python code, then this is a really good place to go. And I really like it for that reason. And I always end up learning something new and interesting on this site. So I'm going to be working on a problem that has to do with XML, which is an acronym that stands for eXtensible Markup Language. And XML is a sort of data organization language. It's similar to HTML in that it uses tags like markup, but it's not HTML or it doesn't produce web pages or anything like that. It's just one way of storing data in text form. Another example of that type of data storage is JSON. And JSON is JSON's a method of organizing data that looks a lot like a Python dictionary. JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation, and it's very popular. It's easy to read, easy to work with. It's much more popular these days than XML, I think, but this is a really cool PyBite nonetheless because it teaches me something brand new, which is XML. Like I don't think I've ever worked with XML in my life. And so I got to learn about that. And I got to use the awesome collections library, which is always really fun. If you've never used collections for anything, it includes stuff like the counter class. It includes the name tuple, which is an extremely useful data or extremely useful Python tool that is like a little baby class almost. And so we'll look at how I solve this problem. It takes me about 25 minutes to get through this problem all told. I'll speed up parts of it, but you're going to see me do some research. You're going to see me look at some documentation as I go through this and really have to read about how to get this thing working and also make plenty of mistakes. So enjoy. So here this is actually a problem I've apparently worked on before, and I just take a moment to sort of orient myself to where I was, and then I'm going to actually reset it to the very beginning because for whatever reason I'm trying to use regex here because I apparently didn't read the problem in the first place, and I definitely don't need regex. You've watched me sort of mouse up and down the page a couple of times, and all I'm doing is, again, orienting myself to the problem, reading it, make sure I understand what data is already available to me. And if you guys think about it, right, when you become a programmer for real and you start your first programming internship, you are not going to be writing code from scratch. I would say 99.99% of your first jobs and most of your jobs in your life will not be about writing code from scratch. You're going to sit down and you're going to be working with code that was already written by someone else, or at least working in an environment where there's already lots of code. So one of the first things that new programmers have to do is they have to familiarize themselves with the code base. That's kind of what I'm doing here is I'm familiarizing myself with what exists, what the data is, what the code is already doing, and then what I will need to do from that point forward, which is thankfully written in this handy doc string on lines 18 and 19. So this is XML, Extensible Markup Language. It's the first time I've ever seen it, but, well, I guess I've worked on this problem before, but so I saw it then, but I definitely haven't seen it in a long time. So I'm just getting used to how the XML is organized. I see that there's tags, I see that there's hierarchy. That hierarchy is organized like the root of this XML is that RSS version equals 2.0 tag at the top, and then I've got a child of that root called channel. That channel element has children of title, link, description, last build date, and item. And item is actually what I'm interested in, because what they want me to do is they want me to pull all the category tags out of every post from this RSS feed and then count what are the most popular tags based on the argument that's passed to the function I'm writing. So the default function is looking for the top 10 tags. So for example, like one of the tags you can see right there at the top is Twitter, and that occurs in the first two items in the channel, but we're going to have to look at every item in the channel and count all the categories. And it ends up being relatively straightforward, but the first time you look at it, you're like, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? At this point, I actually don't fully understand the problem yet. The reason I'm typing top in the find is I'm looking for some data in here that is the top 10. And then I realize, oh, I'm supposed to pull all of the tags out of all these categories and then count the top 10. I think you could probably make a game out of counting the times I do a little circle with my mouse. It's a tick I have when I'm thinking, but I'll do just a little mouse circle when I feel like maybe I figured something out, or I've discovered something, or I'm trying to at least focus. I just do a little mouse circle and then go back to what I was doing. So here's my first Google search of the problem. And I just want to point out that this query is pretty good, right? I already know that I'm going to be using the XML library because the problem uses or imports an XML library and it's mentioned in one of the problem tags. I make sure that I use Python in my query, and you're going to see that my first results are pretty accurate. Now, you might not remember this code, this xml.etree.element tree, but it's actually one of the first lines of code in the problem, and I observed that, and now I feel like I've probably found something that's going to be pretty useful. At this point, I just start to read the documentation. I'm reading everything that I see. First, I skim over it, and then I go back and I read for details, okay? So I've told you guys before, documentation is the key to success. I know it's intimidating sometimes, but if you just skim over it, and then go back and read. If you preview and then read deeply, you'll be able to understand it. Something that I'm doing right here is I'm looking at the documentation and the examples that they provide. In particular, I'm looking at this one that says root 01, so root at index 0 and then index 1 of whatever was pulled from whatever was returned by root 0, and then .text, right, which is a text attribute of that thing. And so I'm looking back at the data, the XML data, which is at the top, to see where 2008 came from, so I can understand like how this is organized exactly. And I actually end up using this in my solution, so I wanted to get a good understanding of it. Part of the reason that I'm able to sort of interpret and understand what you're seeing here relatively quickly is because the way XML is organized and the way a lot of this data is organized, they share similar traits. For example, when you work with Beautiful Soup to parse HTML from a web page, you also access the tags or elements of HTML through dot notation. You can also access like multiple attributes of each element of HTML, just like you can with XML. So you notice, for example, in this for loop, it says like for child in root, print child.tag, child.attrib. So that's two separate attributes. I know one's called attrib, so it's a little confusing. let me use a different term. So like that's two separate data points about that child, both accessed through dot notation. That's something that you'll see all over the place. So the good news is that once you sort of have some of those fundamental skills or that fundamental knowledge, reading this stuff does become faster, just because it's like, oh, I've kind of seen something like this before, which is, there's no replacement for that other than experience. But there you go. Okay, so just to note, that's the first example of something I found that I knew I didn't need to read. That was obviously if I skimmed over that paragraph or those paragraphs and I realized, oh, this is kind of about a special case. PyBites isn't throwing me some special case here. It's an intermediate level problem. It's not going to be really nitty-gritty stuff. I'm just learning the basics. Okay, so I've read the documentation and now I'm going to go back and try to experiment with what I've learned. I'll try a few different things here. The first of which is that I want to try and parse the content. And so if you notice, they open a file on line 13 and read out the content from the XML into a content variable, which is then available to my function as a global. But I don't recognize at this point that data is just going to be a string. I should have recognized that because f.read returns a string. It's not going to give some sort of special XML value. And you might remember seeing in the documentation that there's a special method I need to use when the XML is a string. So I run into some issues here, but eventually you'll see that I figured it out. Now, one thing I don't like about PyBites, or at least I did not like, was that whenever you run your code, you don't get convenient output like you do with Code Wars, for example. And I actually realized a solution to this, which is kind of comical that I never thought to do this before, but eventually I realized like that there is a terminal I can use and that I can just run the function in the code and get the output I want to see in the terminal. This is my first moment of actual success because I can see that I've successfully pulled the at least one tag from the XML, and so I realize now that I can solve the problem. That's always a really nice moment is when you've pulled out at least some piece of data from what you're working with, and you're able to it gives you what you expect. And once you get what you expect one time, then you're like, okay, now I'm feeling confident and can manipulate this data. So from this point, it's just a matter of finagling it and going back and forth. You see me go back and forth between the documentation all the time. I've told you guys before, don't try to memorize syntax and stuff like that because eventually you'll just get used to it if you're doing it every day. We focus on the bigger picture of computational thinking, right? So I'm going to go back and forth between this documentation, constantly referencing how I'm supposed to do stuff. Eventually I'll remember how to do it offhand, but I don't really care in this moment. I'm trying to solve the problem accurately, and I need the documentation in order to do that. And at this moment, minus having the counter, which I already know how to do, I am done. I'm going to now create a counter which goes through this list of tags that I've pulled out of the XML, and that counter is going to get the most common 10. Counter is a super powerful library. It's from the collections library. Counter is a super powerful class from the collections library. It lets us do anything that has to do with counting stuff in lists and asking questions about that data in lists. So it's better than writing your own solutions for those problems. Just import counter and have a blast with that. And there you go. That's pulling out the top 10 PyBites tags from the PyBites website, using counter, using the XML library, and dealing with XML elements and all that fun stuff. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I hope you check out PyBites. It does cost money. There is a subscription service available, but I'm pretty sure you can do the intro bites or the newbie bites for free. So I really encourage you to go out there and check it out. Get some of those newbie bites done. Some of them are fairly challenging on their own, and I think you'll have fun with them. And they're all practical. I love that part. If you're into that sort of algorithm puzzle stuff, they also have some stuff on there that's geared toward maybe the interviewing style of programming, which is definitely not necessarily all about practical stuff. But either way, it's a great learning experience on this website, so I hope you check it out. Thanks for watching, and feel free to leave a comment below if you want to suggest something else for me to do. I actually built a little list of things that I have ideas for today, so I'm excited about that. And I'm going to work on some small, medium, and large problems perhaps over the course of these videos. So yeah, I'm excited about it. This is a good idea. All right. See you next time. Thanks for watching.